Hello and welcome to a quick breakdown of how I embroider text and simple shapes in Substance Designer. So what I did here was try to recreate this sweater of mine, which I love. We're just going to go ahead and ignore this entire part of the graph where I made the fabric, so the fleece. Sorry about that, but I was not trying to make anything pretty. And we'll just focus on the embroidery. Oh no, wait, we have to actually start up here. So basically I just created a simple thread shape, which is then used to create the embroidery. So I took a fibers one, squished it on the y-axis, and then blended it together with a bell shape, which is also squished on the y-axis. And then the leveling isn't particularly important because it'll depend on your specific situation. So I basically have these two shapes, one with a little bit of extra detail and one that's really just the bell. And at times I just used this, I called it simple thread here. And at times I used the more detailed one. And to be honest, it probably would have just been enough to use this one because you can't tell, even at 4K, but I still have it because I assumed I would need it. Okay, so now that we have the base thread height, we can actually start to embroider. For the embroidery, we have two different techniques for two different use cases. So the first thing we have to do is identify which case we have. The two cases are a closed shape. So in this case, it would be the text and the diamonds here. And the second use case are open shapes or like lines that don't close up. So basically everything else. So let's get started with the quicker one, which is the closed shape. I'm going to demonstrate it with the text. So basically in this case, I just used a text node and did whatever I needed to do to get it to the shape that I needed it. This could also be an outside source. You could bring in a bitmap or something. So basically the workflow for closed paths or for closed shapes, you take a mask, you convert it into paths, then you convert those paths into splines, and then we have the scatter on spline grayscale, which just takes shapes and scatters them. I mean, the names are all very self-explanatory. We're scattering on splines. In the mask to paths, I really didn't do a whole lot. Mask threshold value, I changed that value and it can kind of push the paths inwards or outwards from the mask. So if I went here, it kind of goes out. So the main thing I tried to do within this node was get somewhat smooth corners because an issue I ran into was not being able to fill corners with thread. So if I had the corners very angular, I would basically have nothing here. So I made them just a little bit rounded so that I could get at least a little bit of thread on there. I'm still not super happy about this result. Rounding them more kind of broke the shape. So if anybody finds a better way to fill up these corners, please comment below because I would really love to know. So within the paths to spline node, I didn't change anything. Just kidding, I really did, but I figured out that it was a problem. So you're not supposed to play with splines precision unless you know what it's for. There's probably a use case, but I don't know it. And I thought, well, I want to be really precise, so I'm going to just take this up here. And so what happens is this. So yeah, just keep that in mind. You don't really need to play around with that value at all. Just leave it at the default. So once we have our splines, we can scatter on them by using the scatter on spline grayscale node. So we'll take the paths from paths to spline, and as a pattern input, we're going to take the thread we made. Within the scatter on spline grayscale, there's a lot of stuff you can play around with, but I'll just kind of go over the main things that were important to get the result I was looking for. So the first thing is shape spacing. So I'm using the scatter mode shape spacing, which means that I'm just going to fill up the entire spline with shapes. And what I'm defining is how far apart they are from each other. So the number of shapes is kind of irrelevant. It's just about how far apart they are and everything gets filled up, as opposed to shape amount where you really say how many pieces you want and they're going to get placed on those splines. So I'm taking a really, really small number here for shape spacing because I want this to be very tight. Then we want to make sure that we're actually using the thread as our shape. So we're going to put in pattern input as the pattern we're using. You can have different types, you can have multiple. So the duplicate section I ignored. You can basically make like a parallel lines to the ones you have, but that I didn't need for this case. Of course, I played around with size, scale, size random, as one does. Rotation, of course, I did a tiny bit of rotation random, and the rotation of my thread was wrong. So I turned it. I didn't want it to be completely 90 degrees. I have everything a little bit angled. So we got 80 degrees here. In color, I didn't do anything either. So we just have blend mode max. Yeah, you can always see what I changed because we have the asterisk here showing it. So for closed shapes, you could actually combine more masks together to then use only one scatter on spline grayscale, but that only works if the scattering uses the same settings, which in this case was not the case. So I have my other shape here, which has its whole entire own process and scatter on spline because the thread pieces were bigger and so on. So I couldn't bring them together. But here I put the two text pieces together, for example. So let's move on to embroidering open shapes. So the sad part is for this we can't use masks. We actually have to do a little bit of manual labor, but that means we get to practice splines. And in my case, since I didn't realize I couldn't use masks, I created them all. And then I was able to use them as guides for my splines. So it wasn't a waste. Now, depending on the complexity of our shape, we can either use a spline polyquadratic node or the spline quadratic. The polyquadratic means you can add multiple points, and that I will need, for example, for the V shapes. And then we have the spline quadratic, which basically ends up being just one line that can be curved. And so we'll just look at the spline polyquadratic I used for this V shape. You can basically take your guide and put it into primary preview into this node. If I didn't have the preview, then I would be kind of blind in this process, so it helped a lot. In the spline polyquadratic, you can decide how many points you need with this slider, and then you can just move points around. Oh my computer is not a big fan of me doing this in 4K right now. I am so sorry. So in this case, I have 3 points, P1, P2, P3. I put them where I needed them. In this node, I also didn't change a whole lot. The main thing that I did change that's important was the smoothness of the second point. So this one. Turning the smoothness down allowed me to have this sharp angle. So if I turn it up, my computer will crash. You see how it turns into this little U. Everything else, I believe, is left at default. And then I just did the same thing as before, because now we already have our splines. So we're gonna go to scatter on spline grayscale. Yeah, most of the settings are staying the same for this one. And for this situation, I decided that mirroring my shapes to get this symmetry was fine. I didn't mind them looking the same. Okay, so we'll just really quickly look at this vertical shape. For that one, I used the spline quadratic. The spline quadratic consists of 3 points, but basically you have the ends of the line, and the middle one just defines whether it stays straight or whether you're curving it in or outwards or whatever. Now in my case, I used the spline 2D transform. I think I was getting annoyed at having to move 3 points to a very specific place. So I just created my line and then moved it however I needed it. And then we took it into scatter on spline grayscale with pretty much the same settings as we've had until now. Different scaling, of course. And in this case, I did the rotation at 90 degrees. And once I had all of these parts, I just added them together in blend nodes. I created masks for the red part and the gray part. So this, and I basically just used a threshold, gray mask as well, put them all together, threshold. So in my case with the fleece, it stands up a little bit, so I wanted that to be visible. So like this, it kind of gets hidden behind some pieces of fleece, which really brings everything together really well. So I wanted to make a better mask. And this is how I did that. So the way I made my mask much nicer and to get all of this little overlap from the fleece was I used a height blend to put the embroidery on top of the fleece. On the fleece, I made the part where the embroidery comes in a little bit darker. And then what the height blend node does is not only does it blend the height quite nicely, but it also gives me a height mask. And this height mask takes into account the height information from the background and the foreground and gives you kind of a mixture of them, which ends up being a much better mask than this original one, which does not give a shit about what's being blended together and looks super just plastered on. So this really changed everything for me. And yeah, so I used those masks basically to put in the color. You can see that here. And the gray. And if I had done that with just the regular mask, well, here you can kind of see it. Since I used the other mask in different places, you can't tell very well, but it would have been super clear cut. Same thing for the red. That's where it would have been. So it's much better this way. And yeah, we'll just get the hell out of this area because it's a little bit embarrassing. We'll just go right back here. And I think that's it for that, and I hope that's somehow helpful. In this case, I had very easy things to make, so it was okay. When it gets a bit more complex, it'll probably be a bit of a pain, but it's still so much better than when we did not have any splines in Substance Designer. So this is a pretty quick workflow, I'd say, and that's that. Okay, bye-bye. Toodly poodlies.